Before the Ottoman Empire fell, before its secrets were written by historians, there were women who disappeared without ever speaking a word. They took a vow so powerful that history itself went silent about them. But here's the shocking truth: their silence was never empty, and it was never harmless. So what was this silent vow? A sacred act of faith, or a quiet prison that erased women from history forever? The most shocking truth about the Ottoman Empire is not found on battlefields, not inside royal palaces, and not even in the Sultan's court. It is found in silence. For centuries, there were women inside the Ottoman Empire who chose, or were required, to live lives so quiet that history almost erased them completely. They prayed without being heard. They learned without teaching publicly. They lived full spiritual lives without leaving behind their own words. And today, we barely know their names. This is the story of the so-called silent vow, a mysterious tradition connected to religious women of the Ottoman Empire, a vow that did not always mean complete silence, but something far more complex, far more powerful, and far more misunderstood. To understand this story, we must first step into a world that no longer exists. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine Istanbul in the 16th century. The call to prayer echoes across the city, bouncing off domes and minarets. The streets are alive with merchants, scholars, soldiers, and travelers from every corner of the world. The Ottoman Empire is at its height, powerful, wealthy, confident. Laws are written, borders are defended, history is being made. But behind the walls of religious institutions, behind private courtyards and hidden rooms, another history is unfolding, a quiet one. Ottoman history, as it is usually told, is loud. It is the sound of marching armies, political intrigue, and imperial ambition. It is written by men, scribes, judges, scholars, who decided what was important enough to be remembered. Women, especially religious women, existed in a different kind of space. They were not absent from society, they were not uneducated, and they were not powerless. But their world was intentionally separate. In the Ottoman mindset, separation did not always mean weakness. In many cases, it meant protection, discipline, and devotion. Religious women were often expected to withdraw from public life, not because they were unimportant, but because their role was believed to be spiritually higher, more inward, and closer to God. And this is where silence enters the story. Silence was not simply the absence of speech. It was a language of its own. Silence meant self-control. Silence meant humility. Silence meant resistance to ego. Silence meant that one's relationship with God mattered more than recognition from society. But silence also had another meaning. It meant obedience. And sometimes silence meant disappearance. Many religious women lived their entire lives without leaving written records. Their prayers were never recorded. Their thoughts were never published. Their voices did not echo through mosques or lecture halls. Instead, they lived behind walls, spiritual walls, social walls, and historical walls. And somewhere within those walls, a concept emerged, not always written, not always formalized, but deeply understood: a silent vow. Not a single vow spoken aloud, but a lifelong commitment to restraint, modesty, and limited speech in the presence of the outside world. But here is the question historians still struggle to answer. Was this silence chosen, or was it imposed? To answer that, we must first understand who these women really were. When people today hear the phrase religious women in the Ottoman Empire, many imagine something simple and uniform: women locked away, isolated, voiceless. That image is wrong. The reality was far more complex. Religious women in the Ottoman Empire did not belong to a single group. They came from different backgrounds, social classes, and spiritual paths. Some were born into elite families, others came from modest homes. Some entered religious life by choice, others were guided there by family tradition. What united them was not silence, but discipline. Many of these women were connected to Sufi traditions, the mystical branches of Islam that emphasized inner purification, devotion, and closeness to God. While Sufi orders are often remembered for their male figures, sheikhs, poets, wandering mystics, women were deeply involved as well. Some lived in religious lodges, spaces similar to convents though not identical to Christian institutions. Others lived at home but followed strict spiritual routines. Some were teachers to other women. Some acted as spiritual advisors, even to men, though often behind curtains or through intermediaries. Their education was real. These women memorized the Quran. They studied theology, ethics, poetry, and law. Some were skilled calligraphers. Others were known for their wisdom and piety within their communities. Yet, despite all this, they remained mostly invisible in public life. Why? Because Ottoman society was built on the idea of controlled visibility. Men operated in public spaces, markets, courts, mosques. Women, especially religious women, were believed to operate best in private or semi-private spaces. This was not always framed as oppression. Often it was described as moral protection. Speech, in this worldview, carried risk. Public speech could lead to pride. Pride could lead to moral corruption. And moral corruption threatened spiritual purity. So restraint became a virtue. Many religious women were encouraged to speak only when necessary, and often only within trusted circles. Some adopted personal disciplines of silence during long periods of prayer or spiritual retreat. This is where modern confusion begins. Later historians and storytellers looked back and assumed silence meant imprisonment, that these women were forced into quiet submission. But silence in spiritual traditions often has another meaning. Silence can be a weapon against distraction. Silence can be an act of control over the self. Silence can be power. However, not all silence is the same. Some women embraced it willingly, seeing it as a way to purify the soul. Others accepted it as part of their religious duty, and some lived under social pressure so strong that silence became unavoidable. The Ottoman Empire was not one single experience. It was many layered realities happening at the same time, and somewhere between devotion and expectation, between faith and authority, the idea of a silent vow took shape. But what exactly was this vow? And did it truly exist as a formal rule or as something more subtle? To understand that, we must look deeper into the meaning of silence itself. Here is the first important truth. There was no single document titled the Silent Vow, no official decree, no universal oath spoken by all religious women. And yet, silence appears again and again in historical descriptions of women's religious life. So what was it? The silent vow was not a rule written in ink. It was a cultural and spiritual expectation, a shared understanding shaped by religion, society, and power. In Islamic spirituality, silence has always held deep meaning. Many scholars believe that excessive speech distracted the heart from God. Words could lead to gossip. Gossip could lead to sin. Silence, on the other hand, created space for reflection, remembrance, and humility. For religious women, silence was often linked to modesty, not just physical modesty, but emotional and verbal restraint. To speak less was to control the ego. To remain unheard was to avoid attention. To live quietly was to live closer to God. In Sufi teachings, silence was sometimes described as a gate. Those who passed through it could reach deeper levels of spiritual awareness. But here is where the line becomes blurry. Spiritual discipline can easily become social control. Over time, what began as personal devotion sometimes turned into expectation. What was once chosen became assumed. What was once spiritual became structural.
Religious women were praised for being quiet, praised for being unseen, praised for being obedient. And when society praises silence long enough, breaking it begins to feel like sin. The silent vow, then, was not always spoken, but it was understood. A woman devoted to religion was expected to limit her voice, limit her presence, and limit her public influence. Not because she had nothing to say, but because saying it out loud was considered inappropriate. This did not mean women were powerless. Many exercised influence quietly, through counsel, through teaching other women, through shaping moral values inside families and communities. But history favors noise. It remembers speeches, declarations, revolutions. It forgets whispers. It forgets prayers spoken behind closed doors. And it forgets women who were taught that silence was sacred. The silent vow was both a shield and a cage. For some, it was a path to peace. For others, it was a boundary they could never cross. And the greatest tragedy is this: because these women kept silent, history did too. Their stories were not written by them, but about them, often misunderstood, often simplified, often erased. And yet their presence shaped the moral and spiritual fabric of the Ottoman world in ways we are only beginning to understand. As we move forward in this story, we must ask a difficult question. When silence becomes tradition, who decides when it should be broken? And what happens to those who dare to speak? That question takes us deeper into the spiritual heart of silence itself. To understand why silence held such power in the Ottoman world, we must step away from politics and social rules and move inward into the realm of faith. For many religious women, silence was not something taken from them, it was something they offered. In Islamic spirituality, especially within Sufi traditions, silence was seen as a form of worship. Just as fasting disciplined the body, silence disciplined the soul. Words were believed to carry weight. They could heal, but they could also harm. And so learning when not to speak was considered a spiritual achievement. Many scholars of the time taught that the tongue was one of the most dangerous parts of the human body. A single careless sentence could destroy reputations, create conflict, or lead the heart away from God. Silence, in contrast, created space for remembrance, prayer, and awareness. For religious women, whose lives were already focused inward, silence became a pathway to closeness with the divine. Some women practiced intentional silence during certain days or nights. Others limited their speech during spiritual retreats. This was not enforced by guards or laws, but guided by teachers and personal conviction. Imagine a woman sitting alone in a quiet room before dawn. No distractions, no conversation, only the rhythm of breathing and whispered prayers known only to her and God. In that silence, many believed they could hear truth more clearly. Sufi teachings often spoke of listening with the heart. The idea was simple but profound. When the world becomes quiet, the soul begins to speak. For some women, silence was freedom from gossip, from social expectations, from the constant performance demanded by public life. In silence, they were no longer daughters, wives, or subjects. They were simply believers. This spiritual silence also created inner authority. Women known for their quiet devotion were often respected deeply within their communities. People sought their prayers. Mothers brought daughters to learn from them. Their wisdom was not loud, but it carried weight. Yet this peaceful image tells only half the story, because silence, once praised, can easily be expected, and expectation can slowly turn into obligation.
Not every silence was chosen. This is the uncomfortable truth that history often avoids. As Ottoman society evolved, spiritual ideals blended with cultural norms and power structures. What began as personal devotion gradually became a standard for how religious women should behave. And when ideals become standards, pressure follows. Women who spoke too freely risked being labeled immodest. Women who questioned authority risked being seen as rebellious. Women who stepped outside their expected roles risked social isolation. Silence became safety. For many, remaining quiet was not about spirituality, it was about survival. Religious institutions, like all human systems, reflected the hierarchies of their time. Leadership was overwhelmingly male. Decisions were made by men. Records were written by men. Women existed within these systems, but rarely controlled them. Some religious women were discouraged from teaching publicly, even if they were knowledgeable. Others were praised for obedience rather than insight. Over time, their silence became evidence of virtue, and once silence is linked to morality, breaking it feels dangerous. There were women who questioned this, women who struggled with the weight of being unseen, but their resistance rarely took the form of open rebellion. It was quieter than that. Some taught secretly, some advised through letters, some influenced daughters who would later shape families and communities. Their voices did not echo in public spaces, but they moved beneath the surface. Still, the cost was real. Without written records, their contributions faded. Their thoughts were not preserved. Their disagreements with authority were lost to time. Silence, once a spiritual tool, became a historical eraser. And so the silent vow took on a darker meaning, not as a sacred offering, but as an unspoken rule that limited women's presence in the story of the empire. This is the tension at the heart of the silent vow. Was it faith or was it control? The answer is uncomfortable. It was both. And nowhere is this tension clearer than in the daily lives of these women. To truly understand the silent vow, we must imagine an ordinary day in the life of a religious woman in the Ottoman Empire. Not a queen, not a legend, just a woman devoted to her faith. Her day began before sunrise. The world was still dark, the city silent. She rose quietly, performed ablution, and began her prayers. These early hours were sacred, believed to be the closest moment between the human soul and God. Silence ruled this time. After prayer, her responsibilities began. Some women lived in religious lodges. Others lived in family homes, but followed strict spiritual routines. Their tasks were simple but constant: cleaning, preparing food, caring for students, copying texts, or sewing garments for charity. Speech was not forbidden, but it was measured. Conversations were purposeful. Idle talk was discouraged. Laughter was soft. Emotions were controlled. Every action was meant to reflect discipline. Many communicated through gestures or short phrases. In shared living spaces, everyone understood the rules. Silence was not awkward, it was normal. Education continued quietly. Religious women taught young girls to read the Quran, memorize prayers, and learn proper conduct. Lessons were gentle, repetitive, and deeply personal. Knowledge passed from woman to woman, largely unseen by the outside world. Social interaction with men was limited and formal. In some cases, women taught or advised men from behind curtains or through intermediaries. Their knowledge mattered, but their visibility did not. Loneliness was real. Silence can bring peace, but it can also bring isolation. Some women struggled with the lack of emotional expression. Others found comfort in routine and faith. There were moments of doubt, moments when silence felt heavy, but there were also moments of deep fulfillment, a sense of purpose, a belief that their quiet lives mattered, even if no one recorded them. This was life under the silent vow, not dramatic, not cruel, but demanding. It required strength most people never see. And the greatest irony is this: the women who spoke the least may have understood the most. Silence to the outside world looks like absence. But inside the Ottoman Empire, silence often meant something very different. It meant control over oneself. And control, in any society, is a form of power. Religious women who lived under the expectations of silence learned how to operate within it. They understood the limits placed upon them, and many learned how to move quietly inside those limits. Their influence did not come from public speeches or written decrees. It came from trust. Women known for their discipline and devotion were seen as spiritually reliable. People believed their prayers were answered more easily. Their advice carried moral authority, even when spoken softly or passed through others. Mothers consulted them about daughters. Wives sought guidance. Even men, including scholars and officials, sometimes requested counsel, carefully, privately, respectfully. This influence was invisible to official historians, but it was real. Inside homes, religious lodges, and private courtyards, these women shaped behavior, values, and beliefs. They decided what was considered proper. They passed down ethical standards. They taught the next generation how to live. And perhaps most importantly, they controlled access to spiritual legitimacy. A woman known for deep piety could legitimize a family's moral standing simply by association. Her presence, her approval, her prayers all mattered. Some women used silence strategically. By speaking less, they were listened to more closely when they finally did speak. A few words delivered at the right moment carried immense weight. Others resisted quietly. They interpreted teachings in ways that protected women. They encouraged education where they could. They nurtured inner independence, even while outward obedience remained intact. This was not rebellion in the loud, dramatic sense. It was survival wisdom. The silent vow did not make these women weak. It made them subtle, and subtle power is often the hardest to trace. Modern portrayals of Ottoman religious women often fall into two extremes. Either they are shown as completely oppressed and voiceless, or romanticized as mystical figures who lived in perfect spiritual peace. Both images are incomplete. The myth of total oppression ignores the agency many women exercised within their worlds. It assumes silence automatically meant suffering. But for many, silence was meaningful, intentional, and spiritually fulfilling. At the same time, the myth of spiritual perfection hides real struggles. Not every woman found peace in silence. Not every woman chose her path freely. Not every religious space was safe or fair. Reality existed between these extremes. Silence did not mean ignorance. Many religious women were educated and intellectually active. Silence did not mean passivity. Many influenced families, communities, and even institutions from behind the scenes. And silence did not mean uniformity. Some women spoke more than others. Some followed stricter disciplines. Some questioned quietly. Some accepted completely. Another common myth is that the silent vow was a formal universal rule. It was not. It varied by region, time period, spiritual order, and social class. What applied in one city might not apply in another. What was expected in the 16th century might shift by the 18th. History loves simplicity. Real life is never simple. By flattening these women into stereotypes, modern narratives erase their complexity. They turn living, thinking individuals into symbols. And symbols cannot speak back. The final question we must confront is this: if these women mattered so much, why do we know so little about them? The answer lies in how history is written. Ottoman historical records were produced by men, officials, judges, scholars, writing about events they considered important. Wars, laws, sultans, treaties. Quiet influence inside homes and religious spaces did not qualify. Women's lives were often preserved through oral tradition, stories passed from mother to daughter, teacher to student. But oral history is fragile. It depends on memory. It fades when families disappear or communities change. Over time, silence became permanent. Then came another layer of erasure. As the Ottoman Empire declined and modern powers began studying it, Western historians often misunderstood its culture. They viewed separation and silence through their own lenses, labeling them as backward or oppressive without understanding their spiritual context. Nuance was lost. Later reforms, modernization efforts, and political shifts further disrupted traditional religious spaces. Many lodges closed, many traditions ended, and with them, the last living memories of these women disappeared. What remained were gaps, empty spaces in the historical record, and silence, once again, did its work. But remembering these women does not mean romanticizing their silence or ignoring its costs. It means acknowledging complexity. It means understanding that history is not only shaped by those who speak the loudest, but also by those who chose or were forced to speak softly. The silent vow did not erase these women. History did. Despite centuries of quiet, not all voices were completely lost. A few survived, fragile, indirect, almost accidental. Some appear in old court records, mentioned briefly as a pious woman, a respected teacher, or a widow known for her devotion. Others survive in family stories, whispered from generation to generation, a name remembered, a habit recalled, a room that no one entered except to pray. There are letters, too, but rarely written by the women themselves. More often, they were written about them. A scholar might note that his teacher's guidance came from a woman he never saw directly. A judge might mention seeking prayers from a woman known for her purity. A traveler might describe a lodge where women lived quietly, yet commanded deep respect. These fragments matter because they prove something important. These women were not invisible to their own time, only to ours. One story tells of a woman in Istanbul known simply as the Silent One. People believed her prayers brought peace to troubled households. She never spoke in public. When asked questions, she responded with gestures or short phrases. Yet her presence drew people from across the city. Another account describes a woman who taught Quranic recitation to girls for decades. When she died, generations mourned her. But no book recorded her name. Only her students remembered her voice. These stories are small, but they are real, and they remind us that history is not only written in ink, it is carried in memory. The silent vow did not end in a single moment. It faded, slowly, quietly. As the Ottoman Empire moved toward its final centuries, the world around it changed. Political reforms altered institutions. New ideas about education and public life emerged. Religious spaces were restructured or closed. Traditional roles began to shift. Modernization brought opportunities, but also loss. Women gained new forms of visibility. Education became more public. Voices that had long been contained began to enter the open world. But something else disappeared. The private spiritual spaces where silence had meaning began to vanish. The rhythm of secluded devotion was replaced by public identity. Silence, once sacred, was increasingly seen as weakness. The vow, spoken or unspoken, lost its place. For some women, this was liberation. For others, it was disorientation. The world grew louder, and not everyone was ready for that. Today, the silent vow still echoes, though few recognize it. It appears in conversations about women and faith, in debates about modesty, visibility, and voice, in the tension between personal devotion and public presence. Modern women are often told they must choose.
Speak or disappear, be visible or be faithful. But history tells us a more complex story. Ottoman religious women lived in silence, but not in emptiness. Their lives were full of purpose, discipline, influence, and belief. Their silence was not always weakness, and their voices, though quiet, shaped generations. The lesson is not that silence is good or bad. The lesson is choice. Silence is powerful when chosen. It is destructive when enforced. And understanding the difference matters.
At the beginning of this story, we asked a question. What was the silent vow of the Ottoman Empire's religious women? Now we know. It was not a single promise. It was a way of life shaped by faith, culture, expectation, and power. It was a shield for some, a cage for others, and for history, it became an excuse to forget. But forgetting is a choice. And today, by remembering these women, not as myths, not as victims, not as saints, but as complex human beings, we begin to restore what silence once hid. Their lives mattered, even when no one wrote them down.
So now, the final question is not about the past. It is about us. In a world that never stops speaking, do we still know how to listen? And whose voices are we still missing? Not because they have nothing to say, but because silence taught us not to hear them.